This lesson covers an understanding of the difference between a Generation 1 and a Generation 2 virtual machine. Historically, when Hyper-V was first introduced, operating systems that were running inside those virtual machines did not natively know they were virtualized. They were not enlightened. They did not come with the drivers required to use synthetic network adapters and synthetic storage adapters built into the operating system. This meant you need a certain amount of emulated hardware so the operating system could behave as if it was running on a physical box. This meant, for example, that Generation 1, or the legacy type virtual machines, had an emulated IDE controller, which pretended it was an Intel IDE controller. There was also the option to have an emulated network adapter, which again emulated a physical NIC. There were also many other types of hardware. If you look at system devices, you'll see things like Pentium 2 processor to PCI bridge, PCI to ISA bridge, and lots of things which really are just pretending it's a physical piece of hardware. The operating system believes it's running on a BIOS-based machine, or legacy, as this is what a Generation 1 virtual machine exposes to the VM. Things have changed. If you look at modern operating systems, Windows and Linux, they now are natively enlightened. Even newer Linux distributions have the Hyper-V drivers built into them. Therefore, this requirement to have this emulated hardware and all these additional system devices really don't exist anymore. In Hyper-V 2012 R2, Microsoft have introduced the Generation 2 virtual machine. If I look at Hyper-V Manager and look at a V1, a Generation 1 VM, and look at my settings, you see many types of hardware. I have the option of adding legacy network adapters. I have an IDE controller and I must boot from the IDE controller. I have the option of adding a SCSI controller, but that's not for bootable drives, that's only for data drives. I have network adapters and legacy network adapters. I have COM ports, I have diskette drives. A Generation 2 virtual machine doesn't require all this emulated hardware. If I look at the settings for a Generation 2 virtual machine, there is no IDE controller. There is no option to add a legacy network adapter. I now can boot from the SCSI controller. I can perform a network boot or PXE boot from the synthetic network adapter. So all of that old emulated hardware has gone. Additionally, this is now a UEFI based machine, which means this can support features such as Secure Boot, which is the secure handoff from the hardware to the operating system. If I look inside a Generation 2 virtual machine, I can see firstly the partitions are different. If I look at the disk subsystem on the Generation 1, I see it's an NTFS system partition, and then my NTFS boot partition, etc. This is a BIOS-based machine. A UEFI machine actually has EFI system partition, and then the standard NTFS. But in addition, it has some reserved and this recovery partition, so it looks very different. If I look at MS Info, I'll see this is a UEFI machine, not legacy. And Device Manager is also very interesting. If I look at my system devices, there are far less than I had on my Generation 1. All of those emulated type devices do not exist because this is now an enlightened operating system. It is not required to add any emulated hardware because the OS doesn't understand virtualization. It natively understands virtualization and just functions. Because the Generation 2 virtual machine is UEFI based and there is no concept of a compatibility support module or CSM, the operating system must natively support UEFI. This means the only operating systems that are supported on a Generation 2 virtual machine are 64-bit versions of Windows 8 and Windows 8.1 and Windows Server 2012 or above. Older Windows operating systems will not work, and also Linux distributions are currently not supported on a UEFI or, in this case, Generation 2 virtual machine. That may change in the future, and Microsoft would have announcements about Linux-based support for Generation 2 virtual machines.